August 1921. Yes, I'm Mr. Barrow, Mr. Henry Barrow. The man folded his arms as Milo came up the small flight of steps at the front of the shop declaring, timepieces, bought, sold, repaired. She glanced in the window at the gamut of options that Mr. Barrow Jr. had to offer, reaching her hand down to her coat pocket. The watch was still the which, logically, it always would be, for Milo had just felt for it as she was walking down Salt Street. It felt cold on this warm morning, the diamonds pressing softly into her hand. "And you are a customer, Mr. Barrow," Milo replied. Ashby. He still did not move from his shop threshold. His arms were still folded. However did he stay in business with his manner? And it reminded Milo then of the sporadic complaints that had reached her ears about Thomas, though to her she had never seen it. Ashby. Ashby. Henry Barrow glanced away for a moment. "Why do I know that name?" She brought out the watch and held it out to him, the watch casing catching all the light of the morning sun. "Go!" he shouted, looking at it, and then as Milo went to put her foot on the doorstep, he slammed the door, nearly catching it. "Hey!" she shouted. But shutters came down at the back of the door. It was a Sunday morning after all, so Milo went back to the Rutherfords and returned the next day. This time, the shop was open, but Henry Barrow shooed her out. Milo stood outside, not knowing what to do next, but, also, why? Yes, he had seen the watch and must have known it had come from his brother. But he had not even given her a chance to explain. The Rutherfords were in the process of packing the next day, arranging for some of their belongings to go ahead of them to Cambridge, and the Cavendish laboratory was being vacated. Patrick Blackett and John Cockcroft had told her that she would be better off going through the materials they were taking, rather than dismantling and moving the instrumentation. So she spent the rest of that week coming in early until a good amount had been classified in advance, then leaving around midday. She was not about to give up, and if Milo had any qualities, persistence was one of them. And, on the Friday of that week, as Dane began to spit out of an otherwise clear sky, after standing, silently, outside the shop, Henry Barrow came to the door and called down to her. "You are making a show of me, coming here," he shouted at her. "People will think you are a hawker ... or worse." Opening the door, Henry Barrow beckoned to her. "You must care for him a lot, whoever you are, to want this watch mended," he told her, taking the watch in his hands from Milo's as if he were handling hot lava. Beside him, on the counter, Milo placed a handful of white banknotes. "How much do you need?" Henry Barrow stared down at the money, then up to her. "I am an honest man, Miss Ashby," he told her. "This watch is a challenge," he added, looking at it again. "Whoever deigns to make this maligned its very mechanism, put its cogs together in such a perverted manner ... It will take me a good deal of time to mend it." "Why?" Milo asked. "Can you tell me?" "Show me." Henry Barrow paused, then placed a chamois cloth onto the glass counter before him. He placed the watch, face down, and proceeded to unscrew the back. Milo leaned forward and looked at the springs, the windings, the cogs, all made intricately to move at a certain pace, to allow the hands to rotate at the correct speed. "Here," Henry Barrow told her, pointing with a tiny flat-ended screwdriver. "Do you know anything about watches?" Milo, honest by default, shook her head. "Here is the pin, which allows the spring to be wound," he told her, pointing to the pin which stuck out of the top of the watch. "This transfers its power to the cogs, the minute hand." He took the screwdriver and pointed it to the smaller cog, and the hour hand, and pointed to that one. "There is a governor, which swings backwards and forwards, to make the cog regulate. It causes the tick, you know," he added, glancing up to Milo's face, intent on the tutorial, "and the springs are kept in precision with the stones, glass, or gemstones." He pointed to the mounts. "This is ... was a good watch once," he told her. "It is mounted with very thin shards of ruby, which does not alter when the temperature alters and so therefore keeps its time." "But, you said it was maligned?" She saw Henry Barrow frown. "This watch was once our mother's," he told Milo. "Our father inherited this business from our grandfather, who only had our mother and no other children. when he married her. Was apprenticed to the old man before that. Sly fellow, eh? He added, grinning as if he were sharing a grave secret with her. He looked back down to the mechanism. But you see here, someone seems to have fitted now a hand cog that is the wrong spacing, so when it goes round, it makes the hand go too slow. Replace that, and the minute cog needs replacing, replace both, and the coil. He shook his head. My father spent hours and hours on this watch, taking it apart, trying new pieces, putting it back together, trying to make it do what he wanted, but, no luck. Hour hand too slow, minute hand too fast. If it did represent time, it wasn't time on God's green earth. Henry Barrow shook his head. But do you know? Milo asked. Do you know what it needs? Henry gave Milo a quick dart of a look. Only as much as you might know what that brother of mine needs, he told her. A bit of understanding from a sympathetic horologist. If only. Henry Barrow turned his attention back to the watch. But Milo's mind was working as the man's attention turned back to the watch. Perhaps she did know what Thomas wanted. Perhaps she thought that, if he had security, love, attention, someone who listened to him, cared for him without threat of humiliation, without threat of shame, he would be a working watch again. It was why she had dared to tell him to move on from Ern on the night of her dinner. He had not argued, not disagreed. Milo closed her eyes for a minute, imagining just for a few seconds life like that for him. I think I know, Henry Barrow told her. It will take a little time. Let it be ready soon, Milo thought, as she looked at the case of the watch again. In the evening sun the diamonds filled with its light, and seemed to glow beyond the plane of the casing. Leave it with me, Miss Ashby, Henry Barrow told her. Come back on Sunday. I close on Sundays, but, if I know it is you, I can be down. And Milo came, on the afternoon of the Sunday, 3 days after leaving Thomas's watch with his brother. Henry Barrow seemed to be waiting for her because, when she got to the bottom of the steps, the door opened and he held it ajar for her. On the counter, on a cloth, the watch looked ever as it had done before, if perhaps a little more shiny, having had a cloth over its surface, or so it seemed to her. That was the outer casing. But there was one big difference to when she had left it. The hands were turning and a quiet but insistent regular ticking was coming from it. Knowing how it worked made Milo look at the object differently, and she stared at it for several minutes. I changed the metal inside, Henry told her. Stripped it all down, replaced any piece that wasn't doing its job. He stood back, proudly, and Milo smiled too, because she felt that she must, for the man had done what she had asked. But there was a sort of ache in her chest, too, as if the price to pay for working hands had been to gut the entire mechanism and begin again. It almost felt like cheating. Milo reached into her coat pocket for her purse and pulled it out, beginning to put £5 notes onto the counter. Henry Barrow, who was in the process of putting the watch into a leather case for her, stopped, and put a hand across hers to stop her. No, he told her. There is no need. I have the knowledge that I managed to do this. Milo pulled her hand away, however, and began to place more notes on the counter. I was pleased to do it, Henry Barrow told her. Milo stopped, and looked at him. There is every need, Mr. Barrow, she told him, severely. You are a clockmaker, a clock surgeon, from what I can see, and she glanced at the watch again. From this day onwards entirely, irreversibly not how he had given it to her. You have put other work at the back of the queue for this. Too much, he told Milo, shaking his head. You don't need to, but Milo was not listening and instead, after gathering up the notes, tipped her purse upside down onto the jewelry cloth. Out rolled a coin. Milo looked at it, and realized that it was the guinea Thomas had given her nearly a year before. Is that more appropriate? She asked. More than enough, Henry Barrow told her. And then, he grabbed at her hand, drawing his face to hers, and looking at her face. You are her, he exclaimed, the little girl who was interested in my clocks. Yes, Milo agreed. Not a little girl, a grown-up. I work at the university. Never, he exclaimed, letting go of her hand. I suppose they need cleaners, or a cook. Are you a cook? Henry Barrow looked her up and down. Your hands don't look nearly red enough. He shook his head. Milo decided to shortcut the game of professional Rumpelstiltskin and nodded up the road. At the Cavendish building, a studentship, with Professor Rutherford. Milo told him, "Ashby, I am called an academic." Henry Barrow looked suitably abashed. Then, he handed her the timepiece, watched her put it carefully into her coat pocket. "You care for him?" Henry asked, giving Milo a pitying look. "Because you must know about his preferences. He is so." Milo felt herself grow cross. "Did I know that he was in love with my brother?" Milo asked. She hadn't meant it to sound flippant, but Henry Barrow shot her a look. "Ernest, he was with us when we visited you." "Ernest," Henry repeated. "And he gave you the watch." "He gave me her opals, your mother's opals," Milo told him, in a for your information way. "They are simply powder and paste." "Worthless," Henry Barrow replied, dismissively. A sadness was in his tone. "Elise Meitner and Auger came not too long ago to the Cavendish, to demonstrate the spectrometer," Milo informed Henry Barrow. "We tested it with the minerals that the geologists use. They had large quantities of stone brought from Australia, not worth anything to a jeweler, but for identifying mineral deposits. Certain ratios of minerals in opals suggest gold or bauxite deposits." Milo thought back to the evening, when she had crept back into the ground floor of the Cavendish building, absolutely forbidden alone for safety reasons, and operated the spectrophotometer. These opals were no paste and powder. Silicon dioxide, chromium, copper, strontium, iron. All those metal compounds that gave opals their depth of appearance, colors interplaying from the absorption of light. "They are genuine opals, Mr. Barrow," Milo assured him, pushing out of her mind the brokenness of the necklace. Lady Mary had promised to have them mended, so next time she was at Downton Abbey they might be ready. "I am pleased to inform that of one of your brother's possessions," she tapped her pocket, "and of the other, this is your handiwork." "Not his, not any longer," Henry Barrow told Milo as he showed her to the door of his otherwise closed shop. "Yours, by my reckoning." He frowned. "Thomas." Henry Barrow seemed to struggle with the very act of saying his brother's name. "Must have changed greatly since he was last here, to give away his possessions." "That is very unusual of him." Milo said no more. Thomas had, and that was all she could say. She took the steps down to the pavement. Another humid night. At least the Rutherfords were taking their time moving out. She still had a home in Manchester for some time. But that was another thing she needed to get sorted, for she did not need to take up her position in Cambridge until October, and not having fixed living arrangements was beginning to worry her. Milo reached to her pocket. "Thank you, Mr. Barrow," Milo said, and gave him a rare smile. "Goodbye, Mrs. Ashby," Henry Barrow returned. Milo turned. "It's Mrs. Barrow now," Milo told him, and Henry Barrow held on to the door frame, watching his new sister-in-law treading swiftly off down the street. 8,888,888. Lord Grantham must have been informed that the Rutherfords were packing up for. When she got back from the Cavendish the next day, Milo found she had received a letter from him. He offered her his congratulations on her accession to Cambridge, and it ended with his expression that, "We would be pleased if you were to accept our invitation to Downton until your term starts in October." "Of course you should go," Mrs. Rutherford said, kindly. "You will have Thomas there, and your other friends, and we will see you at this address." She handed Milo a piece of paper on which was written an address. "Just take what you need and we will bring the rest." "Professor, Mrs. Rutherford," Milo said, as her professor stood in the doorway, "may I say, how happy I have been here. You have made me feel so welcome, and cared for me as if I were your own daughter." "Then it's agreed?" boomed Ernest Rutherford. "Yes," Milo agreed, and he clapped her on the shoulder as he accepted, and she went up to her room and wrote to Thomas, including the letter to him from Lord Grantham, so he would see straight away what she meant. He offered the invitation for the end of the week, but as the day wore on, and she had walked to the post office, and back, the cold realization that Milo had made a mistake filtered into her mind. Tomorrow, May Rutherford had told her happily, as if it was accepted knowledge. As if, Should Milo protest she didn't know what the woman was talking about, Mrs. Rutherford would have stared at her like she had two heads. The Rutherfords were vacating the day after tomorrow, and Milo hadn't been aware of that at all. "Yes, of course, I am going to Downton tomorrow," she told Mrs. Rutherford, her head racing. "Leave tomorrow? And go where?" It was no wonder Mrs. Rutherford was delighted she had received Lord Grantham's invitation, just in time, she had said. And in the context of the family moving house in 2 days' time, it really had come just in time. "And you have our address?" Mrs. Rutherford said, the next morning, as Milo stepped out of Titus Street. "I do," Milo replied, tapping her pocket, and she recited it back to the woman. May Rutherford looked up to her husband. "Well, that is settled," she said to Professor Rutherford, and both of them watched as she walked up Salt Street and up towards Piccadilly Station. Steam intermingled in the bright blue sky, coal dust flavoured the air. Milo walked over to the ticket office to find out when the next train to York would be. 3/4 of an hour. Milo turned to look for a seat, to wait, for the train would leave from the platform. She looked up, hearing feet approaching her. It was James Chadwick. He had a strained, but happy look on his face. "I heard you were leaving," Chadwick told her. "How long will you be away?" "For a few months," Milo told him, smiling, as he rested a hand on her shoulder. "Professor Rutherford has invited me to live with him in Cambridge. I thought he would have told you." He did, Chadwick told her. "I just wanted to see you before you went." All right, thought Milo. Here I am. There you are. Was she supposed to be doing or saying something then? The gap in the conversation seemed to suggest she should. "You did say you were coming too?" That was all she could come up with. And it must have been, because Chadwick nodded and smiled. "I have rooms above the old Cavendish laboratory. On the job, so to speak." "And you, back to Downton?" Milo nodded. "What will you do at Downton?" Milo shook her head. "I don't know. I have some reading, plenty of letters to write." Chadwick held out a hand, and Milo took it. "Don't forget to relax and enjoy Solve, Ashby," Chadwick told her. "I know you find it difficult, but it will do you good. We have a lot of long hours and late nights and early mornings ahead of us." "It is good to have worked with you, Chadwick," she said. James Chadwick nodded, slowly. He had to accept it, that she was his colleague and nothing more. "You too, Ashby. See you at Cambridge." 88,888,888. But Milo realized that, by sending off the letter to Thomas, and that she would likely beat its arrival to Downton, that she had nothing to show that she had ever been offered to stay. Even if she had, Milo knew, she was 2 days too early. As she got off the train, her old home came into view, and Milo decided that she should go to see Mr. and Mrs. Spark, who were wanting to buy it from her. Animal skins were in the yard, and Milo was pleased to see how neat Mr. Spark was keeping the outer buildings, with all her electrical equipment neatly stored in the back outhouse, his leather goods beautifully displayed in the shop at the front. It did not feel strange, though Milo had braced herself for it, and the house looked like it had always done, though Mrs. Spark had moved things around. For that Milo felt put out, she felt angry, and she knew she shouldn't. "We hope you will consider our offer, Miss Ashby," Mr. Spark told her. And Mrs. Spark stepped from her husband's side, and held out something towards her. Milo looked at it. "Our letter for you, Miss Ashby," she told her. "Thank you," Milo acknowledged, taking it, "and I will consider your offer, Mr. Spark." And, as she walked to the village square, Milo's mind told her that she now had run out of places to stay for the night. Well, there was one place, Milo thought when she passed the Grantham Arms, shuddering at the thought of having to ask for a room, to stay there, a strange place, with heaven knows who else being there. As she got to the lane, a voice called to her, and she turned to see Mrs. Crawley waving. Mrs. Crawley crossed to Milo, and invited her back to Crawley House, for a glass of water. "Surely?" Milo agreed, and her mind ran on as she sat in the sitting room on the settee, Mr. Molesley bringing in a tray of refreshment. He nodded to Milo with a brief smile when she turned to see him, and a part of her felt more content at being back seeing him, and Mrs. Crawley. "Matthew is not at home," Mrs. Crawley told Milo, as her mind ran on, thinking he would be the person to talk to about the situation with Mr. and Mrs. Spark. He is not even at Downton and won't be there for several days. I will give you some paper and you can write down what it is you want to ask of him. I will assuredly give it to him. So Milo did. But it wasn't much. She was struggling to find the words she needed. She tried, Mr. Spark can be in the house, but I do not want to lose the house. What ways are there for this to come about? Before folding the paper in two and slipping it into an envelope. It was clumsy and chicken-wit, nothing like her coherent academic writing, which flowed from her nib like water down a mountainside fall, whereas this poor attempt at fluency felt like bursts of stagnant water from a down pipe. As Milo looked up and passed the letter to Mrs. Crawley, the door to the sitting room opened and Matthew Crawley strode in. He beamed at them both, and Mrs. Crawley exclaimed, "Matthew, I did not expect you." "We came back early," Matthew told her, holding his hat in one hand as Mr. Molesley took off his coat for him. He glanced to Milo. "Miss Ashby is here to see you," Mrs. Crawley said. Which wasn't strictly the reason Mrs. Crawley had invited her back, but it was the outcome, she admitted. "Congratulations on your published paper," Matthew told her, with his broad, easy smile. "It's not published yet, but it is being considered," Milo told him. "Chadwick believes it should be accepted." "I told her I did not expect you," Mrs. Crawley told him, and handed him the letter Milo had written. "Miss Ashby wants to ask you something." "Come up to the house," Matthew told her, and he had his coat put back on for him by Molesley, who also fetched Milo's coat and, with a wave goodbye to his mother, strode next to Milo down the drive, looking around for the chauffeur. "Bother, the man's gone," Matthew told her, as he looked down the street again. "Well, there's nothing for it to go on foot, if you are happy to walk." "Thomas is not expecting me," Milo told him, fretfully. Matthew Crawley gave her a beaming smile. "You are here to see me," he assured her. "I need to go back to Downton, and you are with me. Bish tush if he's expecting you at all," he added, dismissively. "Come on, we can go the Shortfield way, if you are up for it." "Yes," Milo agreed, and Matthew picked up her case. He staggered a little, at the unexpected weight. "What do you have in here, lead?" he asked, taking a better grip of the handle. "Not lead," Milo replied, "some other things." "And you don't mean clothes by other things, do you?" Matthew smiled. "You mean electrical devices, appliances, wiring, tools," he told him. "What's in your letter?" Mr. Crawley asked, as they crossed through St. Michael's Lychgate and through the churchyard, and Milo told him, explaining about her father's house, now hers, and she wanted to find a way to keep it, but allow the Sparks to live and work there. It seemed easier to talk to him, or anyone as a matter of fact, when she was walking, not forced into certain clothes, at certain times of the day. Meetings regulated. The air, sun, wind, temperature, all seemed to make it easier for her somehow. Some of her best insights had been on Sunday afternoons when she and Chadwick would walk down by the Irwell, of what Meitner might have written in her last letter, or Boer in his. "I will have a think. There is always a lease. Mr. Spark can pay rent, and live there, but you would still own the building. Let me write you a proposal." Carson opened the front door when Matthew rang, and he glared disapprovingly at Milo. "Lord Grantham not here until tomorrow," Carson told her when Milo explained she had been invited. He beckoned to Matthew and put a hand to his back, turning from Milo and talking in a low voice to him. When he had finished, Carson stepped away, a quick glance to Carson for the absurdity of the situation where the butler had just told him, the man of the house now arriving information that Milo needed to know and that he would now have to repeat to her now. Matthew smiled. "Cousin Robert is still from home," he told her. "He has taken Thomas with him as valet," he added. "He has indeed," reiterated Carson, disapprovingly. "Tomorrow?" That was good. That was when she was expected. And that was when she was going to give Thomas his watch, for it would be his birthday. But it also meant that, because she wasn't expected until tomorrow, she didn't have anywhere to sleep that night. Being Milo, She didn't think to ask whether she could stay a day early. Her mind, however, had formulated a plan. It was August and the days were warm. There was somewhere she could sleep. "Please, come in," Matthew Crawley invited, as Carson glowered at the impropriety of a former tradesperson being invited in through the front door. Crossing the hall was Lady Mary, who saw them and greeted her husband. "Miss Ashby," she called, with a smile on her face. "You are expected." "Of course, thank you," Milo told her, with practiced politeness. "May I thank you for your father's invitation?" "Of course," Lady Mary agreed. "Won't you take some tea?" "We are past the time for tea," Carson told Mary Crawley. "Dinner is on the way." "Well, dinner then. We can hear about all your work away at university." Well, Milo thought, she did feel hungry, but the idea of telling them all about her work was, frankly, a ludicrous idea. Where would she start, for example? How much would be understood? "No thank you, my lady," Milo told her. "I have nothing good enough to change into for a dinner here." My, Miss Ashby," Mary teased, "you are growing up." She gave Carson a see? Look. "Time was when you would just have sat at the dinner table regardless," she told her. Milo remembered, and felt her face going red. "In fact, you did." "Well, if you would feel happier in the kitchens." Carson said nothing, but frowned instead. "Thank you," Milo said. She was with Mr. Carson on this one. Rules, places for people to go, to be, at certain times of the day, wearing certain things. "What do you think, Mr. Carson?" "Well, it was the only logical thing to say." Carson looked to Lady Mary, who nodded. He cleared his throat. "What I suggest is that Lady Mary and Mr. Crawley take you into the library, where you can conduct your business," he began, "and on completion of said business, Lady Mary will ring for me and I will escort you down for dinner." "And show Miss Ashby her room?" Carson turned to her quickly, raising an eyebrow. "Miss Ashby? Her room? I presume she will be staying in the under-housekeeper's room again, as she did at Christmas?" "That is indeed the arrangement," Carson told her, a somewhat grudging tone in his voice. "Then, that's settled," Lady Mary told Milo, and Matthew Crawley handed her bag to Carson, who carried a little less grudgingly than he might have otherwise. "I have something for you." "I'll fetch it," said Lady Mary, when they got to the library. And when Milo and Matthew had finished talking, she re-entered carrying a familiar box. It was beautiful, and even Milo's eye for detail could not tell the difference. The opals were all in line and there was no sign that they looked different. Lady Mary pressed the box into her hands, lid open, and Milo smiled when she caught sight of her mother's, now her, wedding ring. She closed it, and held it in her hand. "And what of Cambridge?" Matthew Crawley asked her. "More research," Milo told him. "Rutherford offered, and Chadwick put in the first proposal for my contribution." "To what ends?" "Atomic fission," she told him. "Splitting apart an atom with the aim to release vast quantities of energy." "Good," nodded Matthew, "very good." "Bringing down the cost of manufacturing, heating, lighting, that is good for everyone." Carson arrived shortly afterwards, and showed her out of the library, leading her across towards the back stairs that would take her down to the kitchens. "I am afraid we are all up in the air," Carson apologized, as the staff bustled around them, with plates, with boxes, with bags and guns and all manner of things, in stark contrast to the peace and quiet above stairs. "I propose you take your dinner in your room," he added. Milo agreed, and Carson himself brought her tea and a sandwich and quiche, and she closed the door behind her and opened her case, pulling out letters from various correspondents at a variety of universities, and it took until dusk stole the light away before she had been focused on her work for several hours. Several blessed hours without interruption, Milo noticed, though guilt stole over her, as the time-honored chastisements of her father, of Mrs. Brewer, that she was too single-minded, too ignorant of other people, selfish of her time. Milo got up, and put her sparse collection of clothes into the wardrobe. Outside, all was quiet and dark. That was a pity, for she hoped that someone might still be around, Daisy, for example, or Thomas might have arrived back early. She took her plate to the sink, leaving it next to it, But a thought, fermenting in the back of Milo's mind, came to the fore and made her stop. She shouldn't be here. Lord Grantham had told her to come from tomorrow. That meant that she could not sleep in the under-housekeeper's room that night. What she was to do Milo knew the answer to, however, and she returned to her room and took up the blanket from her bed. It was the summer, and the generator room would still be there. There was a bed in the still, the last time she was at Downton at least, and the place was temperate and quiet, with a lock on the inside. There was one servant up. However, when Mrs. Hughes had sent up the staff to bed, Edna Braithwaite, with a bottle of whiskey secreted away at the back of the scullery a few days before, stole over the yard and into the courtyard, and to Tom Branson, who had, she had noticed, got into the habit of taking himself off to the chauffeur's cottage to sleep when he was not in a happy mood. Noticed, because Edna had made a decision to pursue Tom Branson. Even before she had arrived at Downton, she had heard about Lady Sybil deciding to elope with him. If an earl's daughter had decided to do that, he must be a catch. So Edna Braithwaite had made a plan to remind Tom Branson of his humble roots, play to his socialist sensibilities. Not that she knew about socialism, but she was a schemer who could use any belief against its believer, and was now in the living room, asking him about his life in Ireland. "But, you are not an aristocrat?" she asked him. "And you say the rebellion was to overthrow the Anglo hand of servitude?" Tom Branson was nodding, in broad agreement. But something was wrong with her argument, flawed. It wasn't as simple as her words told. And now she was sitting next to him, hand on his arm. Sympathy. "You just can't understand it," Tom told her, snappy.